Welcome, everyone, to Wow Live. Wow, Word on Wednesday. Live. We're live, right? We are at lesson number 21 in our study of the fascinating book of Revelation. Just a book that I think nearly every Christian is interested in, and many people who wouldn't necessarily name the name of Christ still are very interested in this book and want to know what it has to say or have a fascination with it. We're going to begin chapter 17 tonight. And that means we won't be able to get it finished tonight because it's quite an amazing chapter in and of itself. The subject of Revelation chapters 17 and 18 is introduced during the outpouring of those 7 bowl judgments that we talked about last time that are found in Revelation chapter 16. Specifically, we see it in Revelation 16:19, and I want to begin there tonight to give us this introduction on what's going on or what's going to be happening in chapter 17. It says in verse 19 of chapter 16, "Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." Now, last week I closed the lesson quoting from Tim LaHaye's commentary on Revelation, which is entitled Revelation Unveiled. And in the quote that I read, Dr. LaHaye said that the great city of Revelation 16:19 was the city of Babylon. And the city of Babylon, as you can see, is mentioned there in the verse. However, I have to tell you that when I read Dr. LaHaye's quote, both in going over the lesson and then later when I was giving the lesson to you, I was thinking to myself that the designation, the great city, at the very beginning of the verse there, now the great city, that reference, that's found elsewhere in the book of Revelation. And in that passage, I think it's chapter 11 and verse 8, if I remember right, in that passage it meant the city of Jerusalem, not Babylon, because it talks about where the Lord had been crucified. In the city, the great city where the Lord was crucified. And so it probably means city of Jerusalem here. So it kind of bothered me at the time when I read his quote. So I did a little bit more research this week because I knew that we were going to study more on the city of Babylon in both chapters 17 and 18. So I checked out John MacArthur's commentary on this verse, and he holds the view that the great city here in Revelation 16:19 is indeed Jerusalem. So it's now Jerusalem was divided into 3 parts, and then the cities of the nations fell. All right, that's in contrast to Israel. All right, those are the Gentile nations. This contrast exists throughout the Bible, really. It exists throughout the Bible, and we'll see more of that tonight. There's the nation of Abraham, the nation that God has consecrated to himself, and then there is this nation, or the other nations of the world, all right, the Gentile nations. All right, the Goyim, that's the Hebrew word for nations, often translated nations in the Old Testament. And I think that makes more sense in this verse, having Jerusalem as the great city. Revelation 16:19 is showing us the contrast between the great city of Jerusalem and also the wickedly great city of Babylon. Notice in verse 19 that the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great is singled out from among those cities, in that she, as we're going to see, is the chief city of the spiritual wickedness of all nations and cities on the earth. The first one to do that since the flood. All right? And that, of course, would be those Gentile nations we're talking about, the non-Jewish nations. So in this one verse here, fascinatingly, we have a contrast between 2 cities, Jerusalem and Babylon. Bible teacher Chuck Missler wrote in his book, Learn the Bible in 24 Hours, which sounds interesting. I have to say I've never read it, but I got this quote from it. The history of the Bible can be viewed as a tale of two cities. Babylon as the city of man, Jerusalem as the city of God. So the Tale of Two Cities, that's a Tale of Two Cities is a novel written about the French Revolution by Charles Dickens. Okay, and he's contrasting London and Paris. Here, he's saying the Bible could be considered that, a tale of two cities. Babylon is the city of man, Jerusalem as the city of God. Both of them have their beginnings in Genesis, and both of them are prominent in the climax of the book of Revelation. They represent, he says, ideas, not just locales. And that's very intriguing. I'm glad Chuck said that these two cities in the Bible represent ideas and not just locales. Jerusalem, of course, is the city most mentioned in the Bible. Babylon is second. All right, it's a distant second, but nonetheless, it is the second most named city in the text of the Bible. So, as we look into Revelation 17 tonight, we're going to see a number of references to Babylon. We'll see how Babylon the Great stands for a massively, abominably wicked idea indeed. So, here is Revelation chapter 17, the first two verses to get us started. Then one of the seven angels, who had the seven bowls, came and talked with me, saying to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. As I read that, I was reminded of a passage written by King Solomon in the book of Proverbs. And I didn't want to read the whole passage for you. It gets a little bit testy to read in a public forum like this. But in the passage, he describes a young man who becomes mesmerized, seduced by a woman who's married to another man. Chapter 7, just looking at verses 21 to 23 of the whole account, with her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him, and immediately he went after her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver. As a bird hastens to the snare, he did not know it would cost his life. So I believe the husband came back. Anyway, any intimate relationship, okay, outside of the boundary of a marriage between a man and a woman, any intimate relationship outside of that boundary of marriage between a man and a woman is illicit, and it is defined as fornication. Now, adultery is a more specific term. In one sense, we could say all adultery is fornication, but not all fornication would be adultery, of course. Adultery is a more specific term. It deals with an extramarital affair. One or both parties in the affair married. Ironically, in King Solomon's case, fornication would also include polygamous relationships. Pay attention to how Solomon's own sins with women impacted his spiritual condition later in his life. This is from 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh. I guess it talked about her previously in this context. He had married her, but he loved many foreign women. Women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods. and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. The Lord's instruction, referenced there in verse 2 of that passage, to not marry outside of the nation of Israel, was given to the Israelites in the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verses 15 and 16. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and make sacrifice to their gods. And one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. Now, just by looking at these passages in Proverbs, in 1 Kings, and here in Exodus, we begin to get a clearer picture of what is happening with the great harlot of Revelation chapter 17. The imagery of adultery and fornication and harlotry or prostitution is used to bring a message of a more spiritual nature. The kings of the earth, that's the kings of all those nations, the Gentile nations, have been enticed and have been tricked into a relationship with this great harlot of spiritual evil, playing the harlot with their gods. And as King Solomon led Israel spiritually astray, so these kings have caused their respective nations to drink of the wine of their fornication. All right. King Solomon started a whole thing which divided the nation of Israel into a civil war upon his death between his son and one of his generals, Jeroboam, who went and took the 10 nations to the north and set up a separate kingdom there and a separate line, and they never reunited. This is spiritual adultery, what's happening here, leaving the one true God to pursue other spiritually evil belief systems. And all of them originated in Babylon. Look at how the angel describes the great harlot to the Apostle John in Revelation 17:1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." Now, she sits on many waters because she sits in authority over all of the nations, all of the Gentile nations. She sits in authority over them. Verse 15 of chapter 17 here clearly points that out. It says, "Then he said to me," meaning the angel talking to John, "the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." All right, let's continue with verses 3 through 5 here. "So he carried me away," the angel carried John away in the Spirit into the wilderness. "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." Just thought I'd mention real quick, the thought occurred to me as I read it. It hadn't really come to me till now. But the wilderness is often a place of demonic activity or demonic dwelling in the Bible. The wilderness is where Satan tempted Jesus, for example, a well-known place. And Jesus spoke about when a demon or an unclean spirit leaves a man whom the spirit has possessed, it goes out into the dry, arid places, the desert, the wilderness, looking for some place to rest, but finding none. and returns back to the man from which it had come, bringing with it 7 spirits worse than itself. And the state of that man is worse later than it was to begin with. So anyway, that's in Matthew chapter 12, I think verses 43, 44, somewhere in there. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We've seen that before. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold, and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. This woman represents the evil supernatural forces that lead humanity away from God. She is the evil temptress that entices the whole world. In last week's study, we looked at Joseph Stoll's commentary regarding a prayer breakfast that he had attended in Chicago. He told the story of being there. And he had been to that that prayer breakfast for about 15 years prior to that time. Jesus was always welcome. It was okay to talk about Jesus and to pray in Jesus' name. But here, remember, he said this, I kept waiting to hear it. But Jesus' name was not mentioned once. No one said that he wasn't welcome, but the message was clear. All our gods, quote unquote, are to be equal. And when that is the agenda, the authentic Jesus is trouble. It's difficult to include one who has claimed to be the only way to God when a diversity of paths to God is being celebrated. You know, it all sounds good to be open-minded and accepting of all faiths and everything, and to share the brotherhood of humanity or whatever. In reality, it is spiritually devastating to do that. It is ineffective. Ecumenism does not work. All right, it doesn't work. I once heard the story of a man who was explaining to a co-worker of his how exciting it was that his church was going to be getting together, his denomination was going to be getting together with other churches of different denominations, and how wonderful that was all going to be in a common goal and effort. And the co-worker, thinking it through, asked him, well, how often does your church have communion? And he replied, well, we have it every week. So the co-worker said further, well, what if, in an effort to bring all those denominations together, as you're saying, what if they decide that, like a number of churches do practice, what if they decide that everybody should have communion once every 3 months? And the man replied, well, they can't do that. You know, you see, that's a case of, sure, we can compromise and get together if you do everything the way I want it done, right? At that prayer breakfast in Chicago, the consensus among the organizers was not to mention the name of Jesus. If you're going to participate with them, if you were going to align yourself with them, well, then you would have to willingly surrender any discussion at all about Jesus. He who is ashamed to speak of me before men, I will be ashamed to speak of him before my Father in heaven. Now, what this passage describes in Revelation chapter 17, it's far more serious than the question about how often to have communion. This harlot of Babylon represents all the belief systems of the world, which do indeed draw the people of the world away from Jesus, causing them to participate in the wine of her fornication, to take drink of that wine of fornication, away from the truth. The same as the beliefs of Solomon's wives drew him away from the God of Israel and caused him to compromise in all sorts of ways. And it all began in Babylon. In his book, Revelation Unveiled, I don't totally reject the whole book based upon one little thing that I pointed out earlier, Dr. Tim LaHaye really nails down the real issue here. Archaeologists, he writes, tell us that Babylon is the cradle of civilization. Located on the shores of the Euphrates River, the ruins of this city have revealed some of the most ancient documents of past generations. This city, begun by Nimrod, who was a rebel before the Lord, authored some of the greatest evils ever to fall on humankind. Two of these evils will be destroyed during the tribulation period, according to Revelation 17 and 18, okay? Right where we're at right now. In ancient days, Satan seemed to make Babylon the capital of his evil operation. From this headquarters was started false religion, humanity's attempt for self-government in defiance of God's will, and city dwellings for commercial and social purpose contrary to God's command to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, as it said in Genesis 1:28. These great evils, which have damned the souls of millions by substituting counterfeit solutions to natural human problems that would ordinarily lead a person to God, will all be destroyed at the end of the tribulation period. Chapter 17 describes the coming judgment of God on the religious system that has enslaved the human race in superstitious darkness for centuries. And he's not exaggerating there, folks. That's the way it has been. Nimrod was indeed a rebel. He was defiant. He effectively initiated a great rebellion against the Lord in the early post-flood days, which led to the judgment of Babel and the creation of the nations, and then the spreading of this system throughout the world when they divided and went their own way and took Nimrod's ideas with them. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later and on into next week about this. It's that important to me. With Dr. LaHaye's overview of what we're going to see then in chapter 17, let's look again at verse 3 here. So the angel carried John away in the spirit into the wilderness. And John says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we've encountered this beast before, back in chapter 13. All right, verses 1 and 2. Let's read it again. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. And that sea, by the way, in my understanding, represents the nations of the world. All right, it comes up out of the nations, this beast, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. As we said when we were studying chapter 13, this beast is the Antichrist and his one-world system of governance. Notice that this governance is over the nations created as a result of Babel, and it comes out of them, comes out of the sea. All right, so this is all connected. The description is clear. The dragon who empowers both him and the system that he operates is Satan himself. And we remember that Satan is the one who weakened the nations whenever he was cast from heaven. So this is all tied together. Now, the great harlot of Babylon represents a one-world belief system or a one-world religion. Notice that she rides on the back of the beast, who represents the uniting of the nations under one global government. This means that she's riding upon the nations. Religion and belief, all right, a belief system is the dynamic that actually controls politics and governance of nations. Every nation has some dominant ideology, some dominant belief system that undergirds its philosophy, that dictates its way of doing the business of governance. Nations do not exist in a vacuum. They do not exist apart from the belief systems around which they are organized, which drive them, and from which they govern. It doesn't matter if a nation is run by a dictator, for what that dictator personally believes about the meaning and about the purpose of life, about the origin of all things in life, about knowing what is good and what is evil in life, and about the destiny of humanity. What the dictator believes about all those things will determine what he or she decides to do in the ruling of that nation. Even an atheist ruling a nation will guide principles based upon humanistic beliefs. So, in this imagery in Revelation 17, we have this one-world religious system of the tribulation period directly riding on the back of the one-world political system of the time. It's guiding the beast. All right? It's driving the beast. And I think the false prophet, of course, is tied in with this one-world belief system that's being talked about here. All of this fits Satan to a T. He longs to be worshipped just like God, and he has control over all the nations of the world, however temporary that control may be. 17 verse 4 of Revelation says, "The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication." You know, when I read this, I think of Jesus saying, you know, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Humility, a poverty of sorts. Jesus operates in that realm as he's here on earth. Jesus himself, God in the flesh, this is how he approaches things in the cares of this world. But look at this. We see this world system of belief here, incredibly wealthy. The richness of her clothing, her adornments, it's a sight to behold for anyone. Purple and scarlet, those are expensive cloths. The dye is expensive to manufacture, to make those cloths. It's not easy to make those colors. The richness of her clothing. She's the queen of Babylon. She's all wrapped up in the things of this world, the world system. The cup she carries, it's made of gold. But take note what is inside of the cup. Abominations. The filthiness of her fornication. What is in her cup is abominable to the Lord. It is repulsive to him. It offends him. The only person we need to be concerned about who's offended about something is God. What is he offended with? That's a good key to operate on how you judge whether you are offensive or not. The abomination found in the golden cup of this harlot is linked to her fornications. A straightforward definition of fornication means, as we said, to have sex with someone without being married, to have sex with someone to whom you are not married. Of course, a prostitute or a harlot would engage in that kind of behavior regularly. But in the case of this woman here in Revelation 17, the reference is, of course, symbolic in nature. It's using an imagery to make a point. This is not an actual woman, although she may be based on an actual historical figure, as we'll look into. Rather, she represents a belief system that has enticed the kings of the earth and has intoxicated the inhabitants of the earth. And the belief system is totally opposed to God and to Christ. Such a system would therefore have nothing to do with the truth of the Bible, the revealed Word of God. Rather, it would run contrary to, it would run in opposition to the teaching of the Bible. Thus, it would be totally abhorrent to the nature and the character of Christ. It is an abomination. And abominations can happen in the house of God. We see an example of this in Ezekiel chapter 8. A very fascinating chapter to me. It's grown in importance to me as I've looked into it over the years. In this chapter, chapter 8, the very beginning of the chapter, the prophet Ezekiel is sitting in his house. And this is just about the time that Judah is going to be carried away into captivity. okay, into Babylon, if she hasn't already been by this time. I forget exactly the exact setting for this chapter. But he's sitting in his house at any rate, and with him sit the elders of Judah. So the elders of Judah are sitting there with him. He's a priest himself, and so having them there, that would be completely understandable. He runs in that kind of circle. He's in leadership in the temple in Jerusalem, all right? Ezekiel is about to find out the offensive and abominable actions that these elders seated with him are secretly doing in Israel. And as he sits there, Ezekiel is spiritually transported away into a vision of the Lord to the temple in Jerusalem. So then the Lord tells Ezekiel in all of this, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing?" He's taking him to the temple, and he's showing him things. Do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel commits here, to make me go far away from my sanctuary, to leave my temple. Now turn again, you will see greater abominations. So he brought me to the door of the court. There's an image outside. I should have said something like that. He's outside this image. I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but there's an image of an idol outside, and this is what God is talking about. Look at what they're doing. They have an idol in the temple. All right, but there's even greater abominations. So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. And then he said to me, "Son of man, dig into the wall." And when I dug into the wall, there was a door. And he said to me, "Go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there." So I went in and saw, and there, every sort of creeping thing, abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel. Idols of the house of Israel, notice that. All of them portrayed all around on the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. And in their midst stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. They're all participating in praying to these gods. Then he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the room of his idols? For they say, 'The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land.'" Look at their secrecy. This is what they do in the dark. Jesus characterizes this sort of behavior. Chapter 3 of John, verse 19. "And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil," hiding things. These men in this temple, these leaders of Israel, they are loving darkness rather than the light that they were called to serve. This all has the earmarks of a secret society with a hidden secret worship. The creation of an elite group from the very leadership of Israel itself. That's why the one man is even named. God is outing him, uncovering his name for all to know who is doing this wicked thing. The people of Ezekiel's day, they would have recognized that guy by name. That's why Ezekiel writes him in the text. God calls him out for his role in this abomination. And look at their doctrine. The Lord does not see us. This is their theology. God can't see us here. God has left. He's left the building. He's forsaken the land. They have turned to this as an attempt to do things on their own. For they either they believe the Lord really has forsaken them, or they use that doctrine as an excuse to do what they really want to do. And I suspect that the latter is probably the case. It is actually they, you see, who have forsaken the Lord. There is something in this that just smacks of that rebellious abomination back in Babel. Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, "And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city.'" and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. You know, Jerusalem is called the great city, and when God has control of Jerusalem, it becomes the city that returns when Christ returns. It descends from heaven, New Jerusalem, right? Just about every other city the Bible talks about is wicked. There's something about cities and wickedness. If you don't believe that, go back and watch some of the news reports for over the last couple of months. And then maybe you'll reconsider. Notice the similarity here in thinking between these guys in Babel and the guys who say the Lord doesn't see us, he's forsaken the land. We have to do this ourselves. Let's make a name for ourselves. It's rebellion in heart. It's rebellion in deed. God has forsaken us. God is not watching. He can't see. Therefore, we do what we really want to do in order to glorify ourselves. Back to Ezekiel chapter 8, God takes Ezekiel further into Solomon's temple. Verses 13 and 14, and he said to me, turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing, or even more abominations. So he brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Well, what's dismaying about seeing women weeping for some guy named Tammuz? Who was Tammuz anyway? John MacArthur gives us some help in identifying this god of Babylon, Tammuz. Yet a greater abomination than the secret cult was Israel's engaging in the Babylonian worship of Tammuz, or Duzu, beloved of Ishtar, the god of spring vegetation. Vegetation burned in the summer, died in the winter, and came to life in the spring. The women mourned over the god's demise in July and longed for his revival. The 4th month of the Hebrew calendar today still bears the name Tammuz. That would have been the summer month, okay? The July month when things die because of the heat, right? With the worship of this idol were connected the basest of immoralities. We'll have more to say about Tammuz next week, as worship of Tammuz goes all the way back to the time of Babel, and it's manifest in Babylon. Of course, Babylon is about to take Israel captive, right? So if you like their gods, go serve them. That's kind of what God is saying in Ezekiel and in the book of Daniel. Anyway, in the meantime, the Lord showed Ezekiel even more abominations, verses 15 and 16. Then the Lord said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you will see greater abominations than these. And so he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, right at the door of the temple itself, inside the inner court, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east. And they were worshiping the sun toward the east. Ezekiel is now in the most sacred place in the temple area, the very center, the inner court, right outside the temple building proper. The holy place is inside, and beyond that, the Holy of Holies. 25 men are there, with turning their backs on the Lord and on his temple. They represent the 24 divisions of the Levite priesthood. Everybody's involved across the whole gamut of the Levite priesthood. 24 divisions, one man from each division, plus the high priest himself. And they are worshiping the sun in the Holy of Holies. Not the Son of God, the sun in the sky. Yes, God is offended. Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, and he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I also will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. They're about to be dragged away into captivity, but God's going to ignore the whole thing. Some say this putting the branch to the nose was a deliberate act of contempt toward God. We might say thumbing your nose at God. The harlotry of this system seeks to lead astray the very people of God, the priests themselves in the Levitical tribe. If this kind of thing was being carried out among the people of God in Israel, we have every reason to believe that it has been and will continue to be carried out in various places within the church, even in our own time. Does your church have a yoga club? Think about that for a while. In verse 5 of Revelation 17, it really intrigues me, this verse. I believe there's a good amount of background behind what this verse says, and we need not to be confused about the message here. It says, on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So what is the mystery? Why is Babylon referenced here? While we've discussed harlotry in the context of chapter 17, why is this woman on the beast referred to as the mother of harlots? Why also is she called the mother of the abominations of the earth? To get some answers, we have to revisit our old friend, nemesis, Nimrod, once again. We've talked about this original rebel some already tonight and before in our study in Revelation, but now we're going to explore part of his story that we have hitherto not examined. We'll begin it tonight and finish it up next week. So while over the years I have become generally familiar with some of this information on Nimrod and so forth, for this summary, I wanted to let you know I am particularly indebted to and relying upon an article written by Bryce Self entitled Semiramis, Queen of Babylon. Okay, you can find this article online. It's at Lambert Dolphin's website. Lambert is Lambert, not to a lamb at the beginning, Lamb, I guess, and then ERT, Lambert Dolphin, another animal, the mammal of the sea, Dolphin. It's ldolphin.org, all right? And you can get if you want to get the information on that, please let me know. You can read the whole article for yourself. I found it pretty fascinating. And we're just summarizing briefly here. The story begins here after the great flood. As you know, 8 people came off the ark. Noah, his wife, their sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. 8 people. The ark probably came to rest somewhere in northeastern Turkey, in what are known as the Ararat Mountains there. From there, humanity slowly began to spread out to other regions, and in about 500 or so years, that area we sometimes hear referred to as the Fertile Crescent, right? The Fertile Crescent was populated. You can sort of see the crescent in that dark green area stretching all the way from the Persian Gulf up and around and coming over into the Nile River Valley there by Egypt, okay? Much of the population of the world, or most of it, was in the land between the 2 rivers there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, also called Mesopotamia, as you can see it listed there. So, sorry about that. That's my phone letting me know something about it, or it could be something to do with Back to the Future. But anyway, in that region there between Mesopotamia, it's the land between the rivers. Meso means middle, and Potamia means river. We have a Potomac River right close to us here, and if you have a hippopotamus, that's a river horse, okay? Anyway, in time, that region there became known as Sumer and Akkad. And it was in Mesopotamia that the first cities were built in that post-flood era. The very first city in human history at all was named Enoch, after the son of the man in Genesis chapter 4, who was the first one to ever build a city. And bear in mind, we had said that the idea of a city in the Bible seems to be a negative idea, to have a collection of people in one place. There's no telling what they're likely to do. Babel illustrates that, right? But here we have Cain, all right? Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. See what he does? He turns his back on God. He goes out from the presence of the Lord. There was nothing saying he had to do that, but he did. And he dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, probably a sister. She conceived, and she bore Enoch. Different from the Enoch that we find later in Genesis chapter 5 in Noah's line, his great-grandfather. Anyhow. And so Cain built a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So this city of Enoch was obviously built before the great flood, and the first city built after the flood was named after the first city built before the flood. First city was also called Enoch. As languages changed over time, the city was also known as Erech, E-R-E-C-H, or Uruk, U-R-U-K. All right, I got to silence this thing. Sorry about that. Let me take care of that right now. Uruk in Samaria. In fact, if you think about those terms, Erech and Uruk, you'll probably see the comparison to Iraq today, I-R-A-Q, the nation there, and it's the same. Okay, this is the origin of that, Erech, Uruk, Iraq. All right. In all, 7 cities were built at the head of the Persian Gulf there. As you can kind of see that on the map. There's a lot of cities there, but 7 of them were the ones we're talking about. The region became known as the land of the 7 cities. Early mythologies speak of this land of the 7 cities. Genesis lists Babel and then the other 7 cities. Babel's kind of like the hub, and these 7 spring off of it, which are considered to have been conquered by Nimrod, and this is what he used to establish his first empire on earth, the very first empire on earth. Chapter 10 of Genesis, verses 10 through 12. In the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Keep that name in mind. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ur, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So Nimrod was the first one to bring together a one-world system of governance, as he created an empire in the Mesopotamian region of the world where most of the people were. We know that he was a hunter of the souls of men. He was a hunter of the souls of men. He wanted to rule over others. I want your souls committed to me. Nimrod met a woman and took her as his wife. Her name was Semiramis. Tradition says that she was the keeper of an inn and brothel, or house of ill repute, all right, in the city of Erech. Today, Erech is known as the nation of Iraq, okay? The name Semiramis is a Hellenized form of the name, Sumerian name, Samur Amat, which means gift of the sea. When Samur is translated into Hebrew, it becomes Shinar, as we just read in Genesis 10:10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Thus, think about this first empire of the world, this first one-world government, began in Babel in the land of Semiramis. Babel is known as Semiramis' land, the land of Shinar, the land of Semiramis. Babel is thus connected to her name, and it also happens to be she was a harlot, the great harlot, the mother of all harlots, the mother of all abominations, Babylon the Great. Interesting. See the connection, mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, of the abominations of the earth. The symbolism of the woman riding, the religious system, riding the beast, the political system in Revelation 17 may well be based, that woman may well be based on an actual historical woman from the original empire centered in Babel, this wife of Nimrod, namely Semiramis. Semiramis rose to great power in this first kingdom. The fact that she was a harlot would not do for such a prestigious position that she held. So a story was circulated that she was indeed a virgin who had sprung from the sea as Nimrod landed to begin his conquest of the land. He comes up through the Persian Gulf there, lands, and there she is at the beach, kind of waiting for him there or whatever, a virgin. And hence this supernatural origin made her a much more suitable empress to serve at his side. It also sets her up to be a almost goddess kind of person, a priestess, as you will. It also fits her name, Semiramis, gift from the sea, Samur Amat. Okay, so Semiramis became the high priestess and the organizer of the false belief system that undergirded, supported, and drove the empire that she ruled along with her husband Nimrod. A political system needs a good storyline to back it up, like we said earlier. And so she came up with what we now know as astrology, the zodiac. Writer Bryce Self tells us that her astrological system was actually a corruption of a proper understanding of the constellations in the sky, which had been taught by godly men before the time of the flood. God set the stars and so forth in the heaven as signs, and the heavens declare the glory of God, and they speak with a language that is uttered around the world, and everyone understands that language. God set the stars, but she perverted it. Semiramis was the instigator, he says, in forming the false religion aimed at supporting their rule. And of course her suggestion fell upon open ears. The religion she invented was based primarily upon a corruption of the primeval astronomy, formulated by Noah's righteous ancestors before the flood. That would be all the guys in chapter 5 of Genesis. In the original, this system depicted by means of constellations. See, constellations tell stories. That's the way it's always been in all cultures. Did God set the constellations to tell a story in the heavens, in the sky? Well, Bryce believes so here. I'm tempted to believe it as well. There is something that can be done in teaching the gospel message, the message of God and man, and what God's plan for the ages is. Listen to what he says here. It told the story of Satan's rebellion, the war in heaven, his subversion of mankind, the fall of Adam and Eve, the promise of one to come who would suffer and die to relieve man from the curse of sin, and then he would be installed as Lord of all the creation, and the final resubjugation of the cosmos to God through Christ, through him. These eternal truths, he says, were corrupted by her, rather quite obviously by the evil one controlling her, into a mythic cycle wherein the great dragon is depicted as the rightful Lord of the universe, whose throne has been temporarily usurped by one whom we can recognize as the God of the Bible. Notice how the whole story reverses. The dragon was in control, and then God took over, and he won't let the dragon rule. He won't let the dragon reign, so the dragon's constantly trying to get back to his rightful place. The serpent creates man in his present miserable state, but promises that a child would one day be born of a divine mother, which child would supplant God and become a god himself, and return rulership of the earth to the serpent. See, this is setting the whole thing up for the Antichrist, this one world ruler. And this is established throughout the ages, this story. Okay? These fables, he says, were based upon the then widely known story of the constellations, and were introduced under the guise of revealing the hidden esoteric knowledge concealed in them, regardless of the fact that the original was quite straightforward. It was open, a message that all could read, but you don't get the real story. You need to know the real story of the stars. Let me tell you about it, but you're going to have to pay me first. You're going to have to do something. According to this twisted belief system, one needed to be initiated into secret knowledge, and hidden wisdom to know the truth of the constellations. In reality, see, this secret wisdom aspect of Semiramis's religion was designed to get humanity to worship the heavenly host, or Satan's army of fallen angels. In other words, demon worship, devil worship, satanic worship. And as to secret worship, remember those secret worshipers in that hidden room in the temple of Ezekiel 8? The Lord doesn't see us. God doesn't see us. He's no longer with us. The Jewish leadership, right? Men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And so they do things in secret, and they try to keep it in secret. What you really have here, folks, is the creation of a structured hierarchy of power. The supernatural realm is, of course, represented by Satan, and beneath him his demonic host, right? The principalities, the powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places, and it goes on down from there. At the top of the human pyramid of power, in the earthly realm, there's the emperor or the empress, the king or the queen, the high priest or high priestess. Just below that, there's a group of priests and priestesses who take the message to the people, the populace at large, and who initiate them into the religion by degrees. It's the wine of the fornication being distributed out to get all the people drunk. So it's the drinking of the Kool-Aid, okay, as they say today. It's the participation in this whole system by them. But you go in by degrees, but you can only get so far. You can only get so far. The elite are going to protect their power at the top, okay? You see how this works. You understand the structure because you've no doubt seen it in various human institutions today. A person enters the system as an initiate there at the bottom, and if continually successful, he works his way up through the levels, through a series of degrees, apparently learning deeper and greater secrets all along the way. There's a real enticement, you see, to want to know more and to move up through the organization higher and higher. It can have benefits. You get more bling, okay? The further you get in the organization, the more association you make with a higher class of individuals. You start running in a better crowd of people. But one's closer to the top, and the more wealth and the more influence you can potentially get within the system and within society at large. Of course, as I said, only so many can be permitted to get very far in the system. It really is a pyramid or a Ponzi scheme, and it grows only until it reaches a state of equilibrium and can grow no further. If there are controllers in this, if there are rulers, if there is an elite, well, there must always be those that they have to control and to rule. Only a few get to be the elite, and they hang on to what they have. That's the way the world works. You know it, and so do I. And it's a system that's been in place for ages, since the time at least of Babel, and it precedes that, of course, even into the time before the flood. Well, we've reached the point where we have to wrap this up for this evening. But consider what we've seen develop here in Babel and how that compares with what we see in Revelation 17. Under Nimrod, we have the establishment of the first empire, demonstrating the whole thing of self-governance and the establishment of cities. All of this in rebellion against God. Nimrod's wife Semiramis becomes the high priestess of a new system called astrology, the worship of the stars. To understand the meaning of the stars in this system, a person would have to be initiated into the mystery of this religion. Mystery Babylon the Great. Imagine the strong temptation to possess that mystery, to know the secret knowledge, the things done in darkness that only a few know and do. This naturally creates a group of elitists. This is what always happens whenever humans practice self-governance. One elite group of people, exclusive and powerful, ends up controlling the rest of the people. So, message for us, don't be naive. Don't be deceived. This is the abominable nature of man-made, satanically inspired religion itself. There's no freedom in a system like this. There's no freedom for thought, discussion, and that anyone can be set free and can excel in a system of total freedom. Human-directed governance and beliefs, they become self-serving at the expense of those being governed. We prey upon we predate predators. We prey upon those underneath us to give us what we want, what we need. The prosperity, the well-being of the elites, see, that outweighs the needs of anybody else, of the masses. Next week, we're going to continue the account of Semiramis and how her religious system gets represented by the woman riding the beast in Revelation 17. We'll talk more about Tammuz next week. So I hope you can come back and see that as we tie all this together in Revelation chapter 17. Take care. God bless. It's been good to have you with us tonight. Be sure and join us next week, okay? Bye-bye.